A very long time ago, I was blessed to meet an outstanding fly fisherman and guide through our mutual friend, John Pecorum, who taught me so much about fly tying. This man's name was Rick Whaley, and Rick Whaley worked for Fran Betters up in the Adirondacks on the Ausable River. And then he moved down and he started fishing the bat and kill a lot, and he'd had some extraordinary success. And with dry flies, the key to his success was a pattern that he called, instead of a Comparadun, a Comparausual. And he tied it with split tails like you would tie a Comparadun. And he swore by the fact that if you took some rabbit foot, he thought it was far superior to deer hair in its performance. In my own experience, I found that that's true a lot of the time, but there's also times and places where it's not true. But this Sparkle Usual has a special place in my fly box, and it's all because of Rick Whaley. He's caught some, well, Rick's passed away now, but he caught some monster fish on it. And because of Rick, I've caught some nice fish too with this fly. It's a lot easier to tie than a Comparadun. So let's get started on it. Who says brown trout can't jump? This is a 21 3/4 inch Delaware River brown jumping, and it fell for a Compare style fly. They should have a little niche somewhere in your fly box. So this is probably the easiest video or easiest fly to tie on any of the videos I will ever put up. That's how simple it is. We start by, as usual, putting the thread on the shank and we'll work it down. You've heard me say, if you've watched a number of the videos, that if you stop right above the barb of the hook, as I did there, the hook shank will be straight and the tail will not bend along the curve of the hook there. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a shuck tail. I'm much more partial to shucks than I am to split tails. Sometimes split tails are important, but for the most part I like to go with shucks. So here's shucks. Notice how I picked the shuck up. Now I'm over the barb, lay it down. It's in the perfect place. And I work my way back up toward the eye of the hook. I like my shuck to be slightly shorter than the body. Take a little bit of pressure off when you cut it. If you keep the pressure on, sometimes what will happen is the shuck will pop back and so on and so forth. So sometimes I trim it just like I did there. It's really not a big deal one way or another. Now we get to, we could call it the tricky part of the fly, but it's not particularly tricky. Okay, what we're going to do is put on the rabbit's foot wing. And I like to use the material down in here by the heel. I'm sorry, down in here by the heel. I use this for your smaller flies. Not only is the material shorter, it's pretty dense and it doesn't have quite as obtrusive guard hair. And then for the bigger flies, like this one I'm tying is a size 12 Hendrickson, this I would use more down toward the toes of the fly, or of the foot I should say. And in here, if you take your snowshoe rabbit foot, you can spread them apart and pop them, and that gives me some nice work here. Now, one of the first things that you do with deer hair is you immediately get out all the underfur. Don't do that with this. Usually I find it hard to cut out a chunk that's small enough to use. So I cut out the bigger chunk, I don't care, and I'll split it in half now. And I would say that's still slightly more than I need. So I'll put that aside. And I'll just use those extra clumps in a little while. And now I trim. And I'm going to want this particular wing to be about a body length long. So I'll trim it just a little bit more. I don't want the wing to be too tall. And now I tie it in. Again, I'll say it 100,000 times. No torque here. If you use torque, if you put pressure on the thread as you go, you're going to pull the wing over. You don't want that. You want that wing to sit directly on the hook shank. You want to pull straight down. Okay? Now, I always like to check where I am with respect to the point of the hook, and I actually think I'm slightly forward of where I ought to be. So I'm just going to take a turn back. I know in the textbook theory you should be about 3/5 of the way up the hook shank. And I think I was slightly forward of where I want it to be. I always tend to check that before I go forward. Pulling straight down now to really lock it in. No torque, straight down. I like to weave the thread through the butts here. I really want to lock them in, increase the durability. Weave the thread through the butts. Now, I'll wrap straight on top of them. But now what I'm doing is using thread pressure from both within and without to lock them in. Now, when I first started tying Comparaduns and Comparausuals and so on and so forth, and Rick Whaley has long since passed away, so I never really sat down and talked to him too much about how to tie the fly. What I used to do was pull this straight back, hold it down, and create a big bump here. And I'd keep tying my bump and tying my bump and tying my bump. And inevitably, over time, the wing would begin to collapse a little bit forward. It's just not a good way to tie this particular pattern. Instead, watching a video that Craig Matthews put out, he recommended, and this was with deer hair, but it works the same for snowshoe rabbit foot. He recommended pulling a little bit of the fibers back, going in, pulling a little bit more back, taking a turn, pulling a little bit more back, taking a turn. And each time I pull these back, I'm making sure, this is very difficult to see from where you are, but I'm going to rotate the hook shank here, making sure that I'm pulling it so that it goes completely across the back of the hook shank. And now I will build that bump. It doesn't have to be as big as I used to build it, but because of those thread loops that I worked, or not thread loops, but the thread turns that I took going down the shank there, this is going to pop straight up in the air. And there you are. And you do not need to worry about this collapsing forward. Now this is a fly and it's tied out of the snowshoe rabbit foot, which is naturally a little bit of an unruly material. So I just take off a couple of 8th graders. 8th grade is my term for any fiber that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, much like a child of the same age. And now I will start working on the body. I think it's wise that we stop at this particular point right here and take a good look at what we've done. Really, really good fly tying is a function of a great foundation in every step, preparing for the next step. First off, if you look at it, you've got the general shape of the fly, and you've got a wing that sticks straight up in the air without any gimmicks. Next, I think what you would see is that this particular wing goes 180 degrees around, which is what a Comparadun or Comparausual's wing should do. It should not, see how that's 180 degrees, it should not be a narrow clump just in the middle here. Okay, by being so wide, it helps hold the fly to float properly. Okay, in addition, you can see the smoothness of the taper going both toward the eye and toward the tail, so we have a little bump in what would be the thorax area. Okay, the last step I need to do is to put on my body, and for that, this is a Hendrickson version, so I take out my Hendrickson dubbing, which again I always like to start with the Delaware River Club Caucci Nastasi blend, and I spice it up with some Antron and some other colors and types of dubbing that I think are good. And then I dub this on. I don't dub it all at one time because I just don't like having so much thread out all at once. You might say to yourself, man, the dubbing looks a little bit light. Don't kid yourself. It doesn't matter what color dubbing is when it's dry. It matters what color it is when it's wet. And this will darken up when wet. Okay, so I'm going to pull the wing back. And that lets me work on this. Up to the eye. Back again. And then I really like to come in here. Notice these wraps are at an angle. See that? I like to work it at an angle. And then what I'm going to do is work at the exact opposite angle. As soon as I get some more dubbing on here. You don't want to overdub a trout fly for the most part. If you're fishing in the Rapid River, up in Maine, or pure pocket water, yeah, you want to make a little bit of a meatier fly so that the fish can see it better and they're forced to make a quick decision. They can't inspect it. But I will be fishing this fly on the Carmen's River. I will be fishing it on the Delaware River system. I doubt I'll fish it on the Beaverkill, but every once a year or so I like to swing by the Beaverkill and fish there. And all of those waters, for the most part, share in common enough flat water that you don't want to be too thick here. Okay, so what I just did, if you look, is I made sure there were no holidays on the bottom there, that I indeed covered the whole base of the thorax. Now I see a couple of fibers from the snowshoe rabbit foot got caught, so I'll trim those out. And then I go down to where I tied in the shuck. Oh, a little bit much. See, I pulled it there. And then I work my way forward again. Here we go. And pull it back. And work my way to the eye. And tie off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bingo. All done. Comparausual. Wing might be a hair back further than I normally have it, but that's okay. It's going to catch plenty of fish. It's that simple to fly. Okay? Let me just take 1 second to talk a little bit more about the dubbing on this particular fly. This is, for me, this is a relatively short video. When you look at the dubbing on this fly, I think what you're going to see is a whole bunch of mottled colors. And if you look at the natural and you really get up close and look at it, it's not just a reddish brown color. It's an array or an assortment of colors. And there's some olive in there. There can be little hints of yellow at times. Certainly reddish brown is definitely in there. And when this becomes wet, you will see all of those colors come through. This is a Hendrickson. Notice the color cast. You've got reddish brown, you've got olive. If you turn it over, you're going to find some yellow. Many, many, many different colors in any mayfly that you should see.